I want the viewer's eyes to follow that downwards trajectory we were talking about. Repeat the process for some sharks. This time, I'm gonna add an armature and another variation of our Miche-Miche technique. What is up, Miche-Miche here. So I've been participating to Clinton Jones' weekly challenges, and one of them had the prompt deep. My submission was awarded with a win, and I was asked several times how I made that scene. So here's it for you guys, the breakdown of my submission. I'll be going over all the steps involved, from concept and reference, to composition and storytelling, modeling the environment, the characters in Fauna, and finally post-processing. Alright, let's dive in. Finding an idea can take me a while, but once I get it, I like to think of my concept and gather some references. The word deep can convey many meanings, but I settled for something literal, showcasing an underwater scene. So I started scouting the internet for some cool reference pictures. Oh, by the way, here's a cool trick. Google Image Search has an advanced search page to help you find exactly what you're looking for, with specific sizes and color ranges. My main source of inspiration for this scene was this insane picture from Karen Smith. But I also wanted to give it an old school feel, with some divers in these cool suits. I think that a great render should have a strong sense of composition that serves the story it's telling. What do I like in that reference picture? Well, my eyes glide seamlessly from the top to the bottom thanks to the strong leading lines. There's contrast, which is accentuated by the lack of color, and the great lighting showing highlights on the volumes and shapes. Think of storytelling as 3 stages. There's the beginning, that builds to a strong middle, and an end that concludes everything. I want the 3 stages to appear in my composition. I was thinking of something like the 50s, an alternate Cold War between the US and the Soviets, not in a space race, but in a race to the depth of the oceans. So, my story would go: 1. These 2 opponents have arrived at the same cave, by boat. 2. They are racing to the bottom of the cave to claim the first steps or whatever, but one of them has managed to get there faster, and he's about to win. But 3. He's going to be met with an unpleasant surprise. Our composition should serve this story. We'll have the cave entrance at the top, shining some lights to the bottom, and highlighting some rock formations. We'll have a platform here for one diver, and the other diver will stand around there. In my piece, I want the viewer's eyes to follow that downwards trajectory we were talking about, but more in an S shape, to give more energy and more excitement and make the storytelling less linear. Now, if you follow the path of the story, you end up about here, and this is where we'll be adding the monster later on. I'm starting off by sculpting a simple plane to look at the shape of the cave. I'm not focusing on any detail, just trying to get the overall shape right. I slowly bring more details in using the dynamic topology tool to add more geometry. At that point, we have our cave about blocked out with the cave entrance at the top and a little hole for a monster. So, I start placing some quixel rocks to give the cave more definition, always thinking of how it will look through the camera lens. I desaturated the rock textures and blended them with the same unique color, brought in some spotlights, and tweaked them until the highlights were where I wanted them to be. And yeah, time for a test render. Alright, not bad. Now, I'm adding some reflective planes so that the indirect light can make the cave less dark. Remember, you're not trying to get your final look at that point, you just want to make sure that your scene is well lit to avoid noise and longer render times. You can tweak the colors and values as much as you want later on in post. For the water, I'm using a basic subdivided plane covering the entrance, and I'm texturing it with a fully transmissive material. I am adding a noise texture to drive its displacement. In the material settings, make sure that the surface displacement is set to displacement only and tweak the values of your noise node until it looks like actual water. Now we're gonna use a bunch of texture projections for the following few assets. Let me show you how it works with these boats. In the material editor, hit Shift A to add an image texture node. If you have the node wrangler add-on activated, select the texture and hit Ctrl T. It'll give you the right mapping nodes. Connect this stuff up and load in your picture. In my case, it's a basic underwater photo of a ship hull. Now switch to the UV editor, roughly align your camera like in your photo, go into edit mode, select your vertices, hit U and choose project from view. Now you just adjust the projection onto the texture and yeah, you're good. Looks good enough from the camera view. But what about some plants? I've imported some quixel billboards, which already have all the textures you need, and I moved the geometry around so that they look less flat. You put each variety you want to scatter in its own collection. On the rock objects you want, use the particle system in hair mode. Check the advanced option, set the hair length to 1 meter, maybe reduce the amount a bit, turn on the rotation and set it to global Z and give them a bit of randomness in the rotation. We're going to render collections, so set the scale to 1, choose the collection that holds your first variety of seaweed, and we're almost done. In weight paint mode, we're gonna paint over the places we want them to grow, and use that vertex group as the particle system's density. Repeat for other varieties of seaweeds, and you've got yourself a nice scene full of life. But that's taking a lot of resources, so let's hide the particles in the viewport for now. For the divers, I used Miche-Miche, which is free to generate a base mesh. I'm giving it an armature in T-pose and export it to Blender. I'm keyframing the T-pose at frame 0, that will help us make the suit later on, and then I'm moving the character to his final pose at frame 20 or 30. Now I'll be using Marvel's Designer to make his suit. I'm making a very rough cutout. I sew it and simulate its draping. I'm adding some elasticity to the ends and some internal pressure to make it look more like a pressurized suit. In animation mode, I render a simulation so that the suit goes nicely to the pose we chose early on. Now we can just export it back to Blender. For texturing, well, guess what? We're using the same technique as for the boats. Doesn't need to be clean. It's gonna be so small from the camera view anyway. I'm adding the rest of the equipment with some very basic shapes and texture them with the same projection technique. The flag is just a rectangle from Marvel's Designer with a pin side and some wind simulation, which I froze mid-air and exported back into my scene. Pro tip, you can even move the geometry around with proportional editing so that the flag looks good from the camera view. Then I just duplicated the character for the Soviet guy and replaced the texture. I did not bother changing his pose, nobody will be able to tell anyway. To create the oxygen hoses, I'm using a basic Bezier curve. In the geometry tab, use the bevel option to give it some thickness. Looks good enough. To make the fish, it's very simple. Use your fish texture as a reference, align a plane on it, and extrude its side until you roughly cover its shape. Make a loop cut in the middle, and use a mirror modifier to give your fish some thickness. Add some fins if you want, and then project the same texture on it. Duplicate your fish a bunch, and you've got yourself a nice school of fish. Repeat the process for some sharks. This time, I'm gonna add an armature. Place your first bone roughly at one end, turn on the in-front option to make it more visible, and extrude it over your shark. Now, in object mode, parent your shark to your bones with automatic weight. Now you can move it how you want in pose mode. Make a manta ray, or whatever you want to make. Now I'm adding the cherry on the cake, the trail of fish in the S shape that's supposed to guide our eyes. Nothing new here, you know the drill, there's just a lot of them. The monster is a basic low poly model with a projected photo on it. It's a picture of an ugly underwater creature. I don't know how it's called, but it's terrifying. And we're done. We may now render our scene, rendering with cycles, with my GPU, ranking up my samples and light bounces to get that sweet indirect lighting, and see you in Photoshop in a couple months. Alright, just kidding. Wasn't too long, let's finish this off in Photoshop. I have actually rendered the different parts of my scene individually. So I have a base layer with only the cave, then a layer with the divers, a layer with the fish, a mist pass, and so on. So I'm starting off with my base layer at the bottom of my layer stack. It's looking pretty good, but there isn't much going on for now. I'm giving it an initial levels adjustment and start adding the additional layers. Here the fish. I'm using a layer mask to erase the parts of the render I don't want and only keep the individual fish, and a curves adjustment to increase their contrast. Same deal with these fish. I'm adding my sharks and my characters. I actually re-rendered this flag with a new shape because I didn't like the highlights on the first version. Boom, more sharks. Boom, manta ray. Now we're going to do a bit of color correction here, but before that, let's think of how light behaves underwater. When light passes through a medium and hits atoms around, it loses tiny bits of energy. By the time the light reaches our eyes, that loss of energy will translate into a change in the frequency of the light we perceive. Different colors will disappear at different rates. Colors start losing reds after 5 or 6 meters of water, and oranges, yellows, and greens at around 20 or 30 meters or so. Only blue remains at that point, until there's just no more light at all. We're gonna try to mimic that effect here. So I'm using a hue and saturation adjustment and desaturating the reds completely. The oranges a bit less, yellows even less, and so on. And then you can use a layer mask to selectively remove these colors around your scene. Places deeper and further from any kind of light sources should have almost no warm colors. Then I'm adding my water plane with, again, a layer mask. Looking pretty dope. Now I'm adding another layer of darkness and natural vignetting, which will help focus the viewer's attention on the center. I'm adding the oxygen hoses. Now I'm comping in a smoke plate from Google, which I desaturated, recolored, and masked around. Now, the next part is interesting. I'm going to give some volume to our scene. Obviously, rendering with actual volumetrics inside Blender will have taken about 16 years, so I just rendered a mist pass and I'm using that mist pass as a guide to add a blue layer. Now I'm adding some bubbles overlay, I tweak them with some levels and saturation, I comp in some god rays here and there, some more bubbles, and an overlay for the light torch. And another variation of our mist pass technique. Now look, I'm using the inverted mist pass as a layer mask for a layer filled with blue. I'm darkening back that hole to make it creepier and add that monster with some blurring and camera raw filters. Finally, a last iteration of hue and saturation, and a layer to brighten up a lot of my fishes and make the S shape very apparent. And onto the final camera raw filter to make everything pop. So I just drag the highlights and the whites to the right side of the histogram and place punctual filters over the regions of interest with some boost in contrast, clarity, and whites. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is our composition finished and done. This scene was so fun to assemble, and I think it commands many useful hacks and techniques. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed watching this, and maybe even learned something. If you did, make sure you leave a like and comment. And if you enjoyed this format, feel free to hit that subscribe button, because I have a ton of similar ideas with more techniques to show you guys. Anyway, hope to see you on the next one. Peace.